You were gone, what did you expect? That is what my uncle said to me the afternoon I drove up the county road and found a realtor's lockbox on the gate of my grandfather's farm. Those were the exact words. Not I'm sorry, not let me explain. You were gone. What did you expect? I want you to hold that sentence because I held it for 11 months. I turned it over every way a sentence can be turned. And what I found on the other side of it, on the day it finally got answered, was something my uncle never knew existed. Something my grandfather had filed with the county registrar 4 years before he died. My uncle knew about the farm, he did not know about the deed. None of them saw it coming. I barely saw it coming myself. There's a place in this world for the quiet stories. The ones that don't get loud until they have to, and even then, only just. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we sit with those. If you have ever served something larger than yourself and come home to find the people you trusted had not held what was yours, this one is for you. Stay with me, because the turn in this story does not happen in a courtroom, and it does not happen in a shouting match on a gravel driveway. It happens in a county records office on a Tuesday morning, and it is the most satisfying Tuesday I have ever had in my life. Subscribe if you want to see how a recorded deed beats a forged signature, and drop a comment below if you've ever had someone use your absence against you. I read every one. Now, from the beginning. My name is Cora Aldine. I was 31 the year I came home and found the lockbox on the gate. I had been gone for 14 months, the second deployment of my career with a humanitarian logistics organization that operated in 3 conflict-adjacent regions. We moved medical supply chains into places where the supply chains had been cut by circumstances I will not catalog here, because this story is about a farm in eastern Tennessee and not about the work, except in the way that all things are connected to the work when the work is what you chose over staying home. I want to tell you about the farm first, because you cannot understand what was taken without understanding what it was. The property was 214 acres of mixed pasture and timber in a county that still knew my grandfather's name when you walked into the hardware store. His name was Elias Aldine. He had bought the land in 1971 with 11 years of saved wages and a loan that took him 12 more years to pay down, and he had lived on it every day of his adult life until the last 2 years when his hip made the house a kind of anchor, and the fields became things he watched from the porch instead of walked. The farmhouse was white with green shutters that faded to the color of old sage every few years and got repainted by my grandfather each spring with a kind of stubbornness that was, I understood even as a child, less about the paint and more about the statement. This farm does not go to seed. This farm is cared for. There were 47 black Angus cattle the year I left. There was a machine shed that smelled of diesel and dry hay, and the particular combination of grease and good metal that I have never been able to separate from the feeling of being safe. There was a pond in the southeast corner that the herons found every April without being invited, reliable as the calendar. And there was a fence along the north pasture that Elias and I had repaired together the summer I was 19, the two of us working from opposite ends toward the middle, replacing every rotted post with pressure-treated cedar. My grandfather handed me the tools and never once suggested I didn't know how to use them. I was the only grandchild who came to the farm, not because the others were forbidden, but because the others found better things to do and I never did. Every summer from age 7 to age 18, I spent more weeks on that property than I spent in the house I grew up in. I learned the rotation of the pastures and the names of each field, and which section went wet in a heavy spring and needed a week to drain before the cattle could use it without pulling up the turf. My grandfather taught me these things the way you teach someone something you intend them to carry. Not casually, not as filler for a slow afternoon. With the specific intention of a man who is deciding who will remember. He showed me how to read the sky before a storm by the way the cattle moved before the barometric pressure dropped. He showed me how to pull a calf in a difficult presentation, a skill I have used 3 times in my life and hope to use again. He showed me how to sharpen a blade properly, which is a thing most people do wrong, and how to set a fence post so it would hold not just for a season but for a generation, and what kind of soil needed what kind of preparation before it could be trusted to carry weight. We talked on those days, my grandfather and I, in the way that people talk when they are working side by side, and the work gives them permission to say things they might not say sitting still. He told me about the 11 years of savings, and the loan and the 12 years after that to pay it down. He told me about the winter of 1984 when beef prices dropped so far he had to decide between selling the herd or selling the equipment. He sold two pieces of equipment. He kept the herd, because equipment could be replaced and a herd had memory in it, and you don't sell the thing with memory if you can find any other way. He told me what his father had told him about land. That a person who owned nothing, but land owned the most permanent thing there was, because land did not depreciate and did not move and did not one day decide to be somewhere else. I absorbed all of it. Not because he was testing me, because I was genuinely interested in the same things he was interested in, and that alignment had the quality of something rare. I have met people in my adult life who share my professional language, logistics, routing, systems, the geometry of how things get from one place to another. None of them have ever made me feel the way Elias did when he was explaining why the southeast corner of the north pasture drained differently than the rest, and what that meant for the rotation, and how you adjusted for it without losing yield. He talked to me like I was already the person who would need to know. I knew, in the unspoken way that families know things before they are said, that Elias intended the farm for me. My uncle's name is Dale Aldine. He is my father's younger brother, which made him 58 the year this happened, 27 years younger than Elias, and the kind of man who has spent his life measuring what he deserved against what he received and finding the gap intolerable. He worked in commercial real estate in a city 2 hours from the farm, and visited at Christmas and occasionally Easter, and managed to present himself, in those brief appearances, as a devoted son in a way that required only about 4 days of actual devotion per year. He knew the farm's value. A 214-acre property with a farmhouse and outbuildings in that county was worth north of $2 million by the time Elias died, the land values having climbed steadily on the back of outside buyers, looking for exactly the kind of acreage that Elias had spent 50 years tending. Dale knew this number. I believe he had known it, and been watching it, for years. My grandfather died in March of the year I was deployed. He was 88 years old, and he went the way he had lived, without announcement, in his own bed, with the window cracked because he always slept with the window cracked. My organization flew me home for the service, 7 days compassionate leave. I stood at the grave in the cold, and I spoke about the fence posts and the herons, and the way he handed me tools like they belonged in my hands. I flew back 14 days later because the supply corridor I was managing had a critical handoff scheduled, and there was no one else who knew the route the way I knew it. That decision, flying back, is the one I have interrogated the most in the months since, whether I should have stayed, whether staying would have changed anything. I have concluded that it would not. Dale had already been moving before Elias was in the ground. I just didn't know it yet. The 14 months of that deployment were not easy months in the way that deployment months are never easy, but they had a specific additional weight after Elias died, the weight of knowing the farm was there, and unattended by anyone who knew it the way I knew it. I thought about it often. In the way you think about a place that has been the fixed point of your interior life when everything else is in motion. I thought about the almanac on the kitchen windowsill. I thought about whether anyone had run the heat properly through the winter. I thought about the herons in April, whether they had come back, and whether anyone had noticed if they had. These were not the most practical worries I had. They were the truest ones. I sent 2 letters to the farm address during that deployment, not emails. Letters, the paper kind, addressed to nobody in particular because Elias was gone, and I didn't know who else would read them, but addressed to the farm because I wanted the farm to know I was thinking about it. That is a strange thing to do, and I knew it was strange when I did it. I did it anyway. Neither letter came back undelivered. I don't know if anyone opened them. I know Dale had a key to the farmhouse. I know the mail would have accumulated if someone wasn't picking it up. I know that when I came home and walked through the farmhouse for the first time, the pile of mail on the entry table had 2 letters in my handwriting sitting in the middle of it, unopened. I took them. I put them in my coat pocket. I have them still. I came home to a farm with a lockbox on the gate, 11 months and 9 days after my grandfather's funeral. The lockbox was a combination style, brushed steel, the kind realtors leave on properties that are actively for sale. It was looped through the chain on the main gate, the cedar post gate that Elias had set himself, that I had helped him reset after the flood year took out the original. The lockbox was padlocked through the chain, and the padlock was not the one I had a key for. I sat in my truck at the end of the driveway for a few minutes. I had driven 11 hours from the airport, stopping twice for coffee, and once to walk a rest stop parking lot in the cold because my legs had gone stiff after the flight, and I needed to remember what solid ground felt like. I had been thinking about the farm for 14 months, about the porch and the pond and the machine shed, and the particular smell of the place in early November. There was a sign staked in the ground to the right of the gate, green and white. A realtor's sign with a phone number and a web address, and in the small print at the bottom, a status indicator, under contract. I read those 2 words 3 times. I took out my phone, I called my mother. She answered on the first ring, which told me she had been waiting for this call. She said my name the way you say someone's name when you have been rehearsing how to tell them something and the rehearsal has not been enough. I said, "Mom, there's a realtor sign on Grandpa's gate." She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said Dale had handled things while I was away, that there had been decisions that needed to be made, that the farm had been a lot for the family to manage with Elias gone, and Dale had stepped up. I said, "Stepped up how?" She said, "Cora," I said, "Mom, stepped up how?" She told me Dale had been appointed executor of Elias' estate. She told me there had been a will. She told me the will had left the farm to the estate, to be divided among the surviving children and grandchildren, and that Dale as executor had determined the most equitable resolution was a sale, and that the sale was nearly complete. I got out of the truck. I stood on the county road in the November cold, phone in hand, looking at the lockbox on my grandfather's gate. I said, "Was there a deed?" Long silence. She said she didn't know anything about a deed. I said, "Did anyone look?" She said Dale had handled the estate. She said she hadn't been involved in the particulars. She said it quietly, the way people say things they know are true and wrong at the same time. I drove to Dale's house that evening. 2 hours. I had not called ahead. He opened the door and he looked at me with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this confrontation and has decided the best way through it is forward, fast, and loud. He told me before I said anything that the estate had been properly administered, that he had followed the will, that there had been nothing improper, that I had been unreachable for 14 months and the family had not had the luxury of waiting. I said, "Unreachable, I was on assignment. The organization has a contact number." He said no one had that number. I said, "My mother has that number." He said a lot of things after that, about family responsibility, and about how hard it was to manage an estate alone, and about how I had always been Elias' favorite, and how that wasn't fair to the rest of them, and how a farm that size required active management that nobody had provided. I let him talk. He needed to talk himself to the edge of it. And then I asked the question I had been building toward. I said, "Dale, did you check whether Grandpa filed anything with the county before he died?" Something moved in his face, fast, controlled, but there. A tightening around the eyes that I recognized from 20 years of watching people in difficult negotiations decide how much they know. He said the estate had been properly administered. He said it again, the exact same sentence. The way people repeat a prepared line when the prepared line is the only shelter they have left. I said, "Okay." I drove back to my mother's house. I slept 4 hours. And at 7 in the morning I drove to the county courthouse. If you have ever come home from something long and hard, and found that the ground you left had been moved under you, you know the particular exhaustion of what comes next. Not just tired and furious and trying to be precise. That combination is the most draining thing I have ever carried, and I have carried medical supplies through 3 conflict regions on roads that were not always safe. But here is the thing about being trained to manage supply chains in complicated environments. You learn to follow the paper. Every shipment has a manifest. Every transfer has a record. Every transaction that has ever been real has left a document somewhere with a date on it. You do not ask what happened. You find the paperwork and let the paperwork tell you. I went to the county register of deeds at 7:47 in the morning when the clerk's window opened. I gave her the property address. I asked for the deed history on the parcel. She typed for about 30 seconds. She printed 2 pages. She slid them through the window without comment the way clerks do when they have been doing their jobs for a long time and understand that the paper is the whole conversation. I stood at the window and I read the first page. There was a warranty deed recorded 4 years and 3 months before Elias Aldine died. Filed November 14th. Grantor, Elias Ray Aldine. Grantee Cora Elaine Aldine, my name. In full, in a document that had been sitting in the county records for 4 years. I read it again. The deed conveyed the property, all 214 acres, the farmhouse, the outbuildings, the ponds, the timber rights to me, effective upon the death of the grantor, with a life estate reserved for Elias' continued residence and use until that time. It was notarized. It was witnessed. It was recorded. It had a book number and a page number and a filing timestamp and a clerk's stamp in the margin. It was more legally complete than anything I had encountered in 14 months of international supply chain documentation. I stood at that window for probably a full minute. The clerk watched me without urgency. I said, "Can I get a certified copy of this?" She said, "That's the certified copy." I folded it carefully. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, against my ribs. And I walked out of the county courthouse into the November morning and sat on the stone steps and let the cold come in through my coat. My grandfather had done this 4 years before he died. He had walked into that courthouse or had someone drive him, and he had filed a deed with my name on it, and he had not told me, and he had not told anyone else either. He had just done it. Quietly, in the way he did everything that mattered. The way he handed me the tools without announcing that they belonged in my hands. He knew something might happen. He had watched his son for 60 years. He had decided not to leave what mattered to chance. I sat on those courthouse steps for a long time. I thought about the fence posts. I thought about the north pasture and the herons and the green shutters he repainted every spring. I thought about a man who had spent his whole life tending things carefully and had tended this, too, the most important thing, in the same way, without spectacle. Just the right tools in the right hands at the right time. I got up. I drove to find a lawyer. I want to stop here a second. If you have ever had someone use your absence against you, a deployment, a job across the country, a season when you were surviving something nobody saw, and you came back to find what you left had been handed to someone else, leave one word below for me, just one. I will know what it means. And if you want to see how a 4-year-old deed holds up against a near-complete property sale, subscribe and stay. I promise you the Tuesday morning at the courthouse is not the last thing that happens. Back to it. The lawyer's name was June Whitfield. She had an office above the farm supply store on the main street of town, which I understood immediately was not a coincidence. A lawyer who sets up shop above a farm supply store in a county like that one is a lawyer who intends to be findable by the people who need finding. She had a desk covered in folders and a window that looked out over a parking lot, and the kind of unhurried directness that comes from 20 years of watching families fight over land. I set the certified deed on her desk. I sat down. I told her in 11 minutes everything I have told you because I have always been able to summarize. June read the deed. She read it twice. Then she set it flat on her desk and looked at me over the top of her reading glasses with an expression that was not quite a smile but was something in the vicinity of professional satisfaction. She said, "This deed was properly recorded and takes precedence over any subsequent conveyance by the grantor's estate. Your uncle had no legal authority to sell this property. The purported sale is void." I said, "Can he argue the will supersedes it?" She said, "He can argue whatever he likes." A recorded deed of this kind, with a life estate reservation, transfers ownership at death. The will can only convey what the decedent owned at the time of death. Your grandfather did not own this property at the time of his death. He had the right to live on it. That's not the same thing. She said this the way she had clearly said similar things many times, patiently and without theater, because the law on this point was not ambiguous and did not require theater. I asked about the buyer. She said that was where things got complicated. A buyer under contract who had not yet closed was not the same as a buyer who had taken title. We needed to move fast, but we were not too late. She would send a letter to the title company that same day. I asked about Dale. June looked at me for a moment. Then she said that would depend on what the investigation found about how the estate had been administered, whether the deed had been knowingly concealed, or whether it had simply not been discovered. She said those were different things legally, though they might feel the same from where I was sitting. She was right that they felt the same. I noted she did not say they were the same. I left her office with a list of things she needed from me and a second appointment the following Thursday. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a moment. Above the farm supply store, through the second-floor window, I could see June already on the phone. I drove back to my mother's house. I sat in the kitchen, which was warm and smelled of the same coffee it had always smelled of, and I put my hands flat on the table. My mother came in. She sat across from me. She looked at my face and she said, "You found something." I said, "Grandpa filed a deed. 4 years ago, my name is on it." My mother sat very still. She has the Aldine quality of stillness under shock, the capacity to hold something large without immediately reshaping it into words. She looked at her hands. Then she said very quietly, "He never told me." I said, "He never told anyone." She looked up. There was something in her face that I had not seen before or had not recognized before, a specific grief. Not for the farm, for the man who had known his own son well enough to protect his granddaughter from him in silence for 4 years without burdening anyone with the knowledge of it. She said, "He was always thinking about what came next." I said, "I know." We sat in her kitchen for a while. We didn't say much more. Some things are large enough that sitting in the same room with them is the whole conversation. The 3 weeks between the courthouse and the settlement were the hardest of the whole stretch. Not because I doubted the deed. The deed was sound, and June had made that clear within the first 10 minutes. But waiting is its own particular discipline, and I had been trained in moving things forward, not waiting for systems to resolve, and the law moves at the law's pace regardless of what you know and when you knew it. I went to the farm every day during those weeks. There was no practical reason to go daily. Nothing needed doing that required a daily visit. The power was on a reduced cycle. The outbuildings were locked. The cattle were gone. But I went anyway. I unlocked the gate, and I drove in and I walked the perimeter of the farmhouse, and looked at the machine shed and the empty pasture and the pond. I was doing what my grandfather had done every morning of his adult life on this land. I was checking on it. I was reminding it and reminding myself that I was here and it was here, and those two things were not going to be separated by a deed filed in the wrong name. On the 9th day, the almanac had slipped off the windowsill and fallen behind the counter. I picked it up. I put it back. Small thing. Important to put it back. June called on a Thursday evening the second week. She said the title company had completed their review. She said the recorded deed was being recognized as the controlling instrument. She said the investment group's attorney had called that afternoon to indicate their client was prepared to withdraw upon return of the good faith deposit. She said it in her flat professional way, the way she said everything that mattered. I sat in the farmhouse kitchen with the phone in my hand and the almanac on the windowsill, and the heat just starting to come up through the old registers, and I said, "Thank you, June." She said, "Your grandfather did the work, I just filed the paperwork." That was not entirely true, but I understood what she meant by it. The sale did not close. June's letter reached the title company before the closing date, which had been scheduled for the following Friday. The title company put the transaction on hold pending resolution of a competing ownership claim. The buyer, a land investment group from out of state, had their attorney call June's office within the hour. June handled it the way she handled everything. Quietly, completely, with documentation. Dale called me 4 days after the letter went out. He did not open with an apology. He opened with an explanation, which is the way people who have done something indefensible try to convert the subject from what they did to why they did it. He said he had found the will and administered the estate according to it. He said the deed had not surfaced in the title search, which was the title company's responsibility, not his. He said there had been a lot of pressure, a lot of debt on the estate, costs I had not been present to manage. I let him talk until the explanation became a circle. Then I said, "Dale, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer it directly." He said, "Okay." I said, "Did you know about the deed?" Silence. I said, "I'm going to find out either way. June is going through the estate records. If it came up in the title search and was set aside, that's in the documentation." More silence. And then into that silence the smallest sound, not a word, not quite a confession. The sound of a man who had constructed a version of events that he had been living inside, and who could feel the walls of it beginning to give. He said, "I thought the will was the controlling document." That sentence, careful and lawyerly, was the closest Dale Aldine was ever going to come to admitting that he had seen the deed and chosen the will instead. I did not push for more. I had the deed. The deed was enough. I said, "Okay, Dale," and I hung up. There is a specific feeling that comes with the end of a fight you have been carrying alone. It does not feel like winning, not immediately. It feels like setting something down that you have been holding so long the weight became normal, and your hands don't know what to do without it. I drove out to the farm the week after the sale collapsed. June had sent formal notice to all parties. The lockbox had been removed from the gate by the time I got there, though I did not have an explanation for who had removed it or when. The gate was just the gate again, the cedar post, the chain, the lock I had the key for. I unlocked it. I drove in. I sat in the truck for a moment at the end of the lane where you can see the whole front of the farmhouse from the driveway before you reach it. The white paint. The green shutters faded to old sage, which meant they were due for another coat in spring. The porch with the 2 chairs Elias had kept there for 40 years, wood and rusted iron, pushed to the same angle they had always been at, as though no one had touched them, and no one had needed to, because they were already where they were supposed to be. I have been in a lot of places. I have managed supply routes in areas where the infrastructure had been destroyed and rebuilt twice and destroyed again. I have slept in conditions that would not be described as comfortable by any reasonable standard. I am not someone who is particularly moved by houses. I have not lived in one place long enough to let a structure become identity. But I sat at the end of that driveway for a few minutes, and I let myself feel what I was feeling, which was the particular relief of a person arriving somewhere they belong after a long time of being somewhere they didn't. The farm in November was the particular version of itself I loved most. The pastures gone to winter dormancy, the timber on the ridge showing its bones, the heron pond with a skin of ice at the edges that would thaw by afternoon. The cattle were gone. They had been sold as part of the estate liquidation. That part I could not undo. I stood at the fence of the empty pasture and looked at the 47 spaces where the Angus had been and let that be what it was. The farmhouse was cold. The power had been on a reduced billing cycle, but the heat had not been run. I turned the heat on. I walked through each room the way you walk through a place after a long absence, checking. The coffee can of fence staples on the shelf in the mudroom, the almanac on the kitchen windowsill, the pages soft with handling, the spare key on the hook by the back door that Elias had put there in 1987 and never moved. There was one more thing. In the drawer of the roll-top desk in what Elias called the office, which was a room with a desk and a filing cabinet and a window that looked north, I found an envelope. My name on the front in his handwriting. Cora, not Cora Elaine, not even Cora girl the way he said it. Just Cora. His hand, which had been a careful hand even in age, each letter placed like it was going somewhere it needed to arrive. I sat in the desk chair and I opened it. He had written 2 paragraphs. I will not read them to you. They are mine and they are between me and the man who wrote them and the farm that is the context of every word. But I will tell you what the second paragraph said in its plain form, because it is the reason I can tell this story without anger. He wrote, I know Dale. I have known him his whole life, and I know what he will do when I am gone if I don't make it impossible. I'm making it impossible. You were always the one who came to the farm, and I was always grateful for it even when I didn't say it right. Take care of the herons. They'll be there in April whether you're watching or not, but it's better if you are. Take care of the herons. My grandfather, who had been tending things carefully for 88 years, had tended this too, had seen the whole shape of it, had moved quietly through the steps required. Had not told me, because telling me would have required a conversation about what he expected Dale to do, and my grandfather had not been a man who talked about the sad things when the practical ones would do. He had just filed the deed. He had just left the letter. He had trusted the paperwork and the herons and the fence along the north pasture that we had fixed together, and the fact that I would come back. He was right about all of it. The woman who mattered, in the way that mattered, was not a lawyer and not a family member. She was a neighbor named Patris Odom, who had lived on the property adjoining the eastern border of the farm for 31 years, and who had, in the 14 months I was overseas, watched over the place with the steady attention of someone who has decided that certain things are worth watching even when watching isn't your formal responsibility. It was Patris who had noticed the for sale sign go up. It was Patris who had written down the realtor's number and the listing date and the name of the title company from the public records, and who had put all of it in a folder that she kept on her kitchen table against the day I came home. She had not known my forwarding address overseas. She had not had a way to reach me. What she had done instead was keep the record and wait. She came to the farm 3 days after I unlocked the gate for the first time. She knocked on the door with the folder under her arm and a container of soup in her other hand, the practical kind of offering, hot food and documentation, which is what a person brings when they have been watching from a fence line for 14 months and have a lot to say. She set the folder on the table. She sat down. She told me everything she had seen, in chronological order, beginning with the first time Dale's car had appeared in the driveway after the funeral. She had a timeline. She had written dates in a small notebook, not for any official purpose, just because Patris Odom was the kind of person who kept records of things that seemed wrong, on the grounds that records of wrong things occasionally became important. She told me about the realtor's first visit, the SUV with the county plates that had sat at the gate for 40 minutes on a Thursday in May. She told me about the weekend in July when a truck she didn't recognize had pulled into the machine shed and stayed for 2 hours. She had written down the license plate. She had not known what to do with it at the time. She had written it down anyway, because that is what you do when you don't know what's useful yet. You keep everything and sort it later. She told me about August, when the for sale sign went up. She had stood at her kitchen window with her morning coffee and looked at it for a long time. Then she had gone out, walked to the road, written down the realtor's name and number and the listing date from the sign. She had gone to the county website and found the public sale listing and written down the parcel number and the listed price and the name of the title company handling the transaction. The listed price was $2,140,000. Patris set the notebook beside the folder. She said, "I didn't know if any of this was useful." I looked at the notebook. I looked at the folder. I looked at a woman who had kept a record for 14 months against the chance that it might matter to someone she had never been formally asked to protect. A woman who had watched from the east side of a fence line through one full year of seasons and had written down what she saw. I said, "Patris, this is more useful than you know." June would use the notebook. The dates in it corroborated the estate timeline in ways that would matter when Dale's story was compared against the documentation. A lawyer who moves fast needs corroboration that came from somewhere other than the client, and Patris's handwritten timeline, with its plate numbers and signed dates and listed prices, was exactly the kind of corroboration that comes from someone who had no stake in the outcome except proximity to what was right. She nodded. She stayed for soup. We sat at Elia's kitchen table with the almanac on the windowsill and the heat coming up through the old registers and the November light going sideways through the north window. She told me about the farm in the months I'd been gone, not the Dale parts, the farm parts, how the heron had come back in April, a mated pair this year, new, how the north pasture had held through a wet September without the cattle to churn it up. How she had watched the timber on the ridge turn in October from her kitchen window because the colors came in best from the east side and her kitchen faced east. She told me she had left a note in the mailbox in June, addressed to whoever was handling the estate, asking whether the property might need anyone to keep an eye on things, that she was right next door and willing. Nobody had responded. She said it without bitterness. That was the part that stayed with me. She had offered, been ignored, and kept watching anyway, because the watching was not conditional on being acknowledged. It was just the right thing to do for a piece of land she had been adjacent to for 31 years, and for a man she had respected, and for the granddaughter she had only met a handful of times but whose name Elias had said often enough that she knew whose name mattered. I listened to all of it. I was, in ways I am still sorting out, more grateful for the farm parts than for the folder. Though I needed the folder, and June needed the notebook, and the case would not have been what it was without Patris's 14 months of quiet witnessing. Some people show up with tools. Some people show up with soup and a timeline. The ones who show up at all are the ones you build the table around. The estate dispute settled the following spring. I will not give you the full legal architecture of it because this is not a legal proceeding, and June has her own story to tell. What I will tell you is the outcome, which is simple and is exactly what the deed said it should be. The farm is mine. The investment group was compensated for their good faith deposit and withdrew without litigation, because their attorney looked at the recorded deed and understood immediately that there was nothing to litigate. The estate was unwound. The cattle were gone, and that was a grief I sat with, but the land was there, and the fence was there, and the farmhouse was there, and the herons came back in April the same as they always had. Two of them, the same mated pair Patris had described, back in the place they had decided to be, reliable as the calendar, the way herons are. I stood at the pond the morning they came back and watched them work the shallows for a while. They were not interested in me. They were interested in the pond, which had been there before I was born and would be there after, and which they had every right to treat as home. I appreciated their indifference. It was the most normal thing that had happened in months. Dale did not come to the farm after the settlement. He called once, in February, on a Thursday evening. He said he had made decisions he regretted. He said the farm had always meant more to him than he'd let on, which I believed, and which explained more about what he had done than he intended it to. He said he hoped someday we could put it behind us. I listened to all of that. I let it settle. Then I said, "Dale, Grandpa knew what you would do. He made it impossible anyway, that's what this was." He was quiet for a long time. He said he hadn't realized the deed existed. I let that go. It was possible. It was also not the point. The point was that a man who genuinely had not been trying to take what wasn't his would have asked the question, would have looked, would have gone to the county records office and done what I had done on a Tuesday morning in 40 seconds at a clerk's window. He hadn't asked. He hadn't looked. He had found a will that suited him, and he had administered it in the direction that suited him, and he had moved fast before his overseas niece could come home and complicate the picture. That's a choice. Not knowing and not looking are different things. I did not say this to Dale. He had given me the closest thing to a reckoning he was able to give, which was limited, and I chose to receive it at face value because the alternative was spending more of my life on Dale Aldine's capacity for honesty, and I had better uses for the time. I said, I'm not interested in punishing you, but I'm also not interested in pretending. If there comes a day when you want to have an honest conversation, I'll have it. He said okay. He didn't call again that winter. The door is at the width it is. I do not close it further and I do not open it wider, and I tend what's on my side of it, which is considerable and getting more so. My mother came to the farm in May. First time she had been there since Elias died. She walked the perimeter of the farmhouse with her hands in her coat pockets and her face doing something she did not explain to me. At the north fence, the one I had repaired with my grandfather, she put her hand on a cedar post and held it for a moment. She said, he knew she'd come back. I didn't know if she meant me or the herons. I think she meant both. She stayed for dinner. We ate at Elias' kitchen table with the almanac on the windowsill, and Patris came over because Patris comes on Sundays now, and this was close enough. 3 women at a table on a May evening, eating food grown mostly on the property, and talking about the heron pair and whether they were nesting in the same spot as last year. Which they were. That dinner, ordinary as it was, felt like the whole point of everything that had preceded it. Not the deed, not the Tuesday at the courthouse, not Dale's call, not the lockbox on the gate. This. A table set for people who showed up. A kitchen with light in it. An almanac soft from handling on the windowsill. Everything Elias had been tending for 50 years, intact and breathing. I am telling you this story from the farm. Right now today, I have been back 11 months, which is almost exactly as long as I was gone. The power is fully on. The heat runs. The machine shed smells the same, which is the first thing I checked when I unlocked the building the week I came back. Some things are more important than they sound. I have 8 cattle now, not 47, because starting over is different from inheriting, and I am choosing my pace. The north pasture is in spring grass and the herons are there, the mated pair Patris told me about, and they have nested on the eastern edge of the pond where it is sheltered by the timber. I repainted the shutters in April. Green, the same color, matched from a chip I pried off the trim on the south-facing wall where the old paint was thickest and had stayed truest. It took 2 days and the color is right. My grandfather painted them every spring, and I will paint them every spring because some habits are worth inheriting even when the person who kept them is gone. Patris comes for dinner on Sundays. She brings things she grows and I cook with them, and we eat at Elias' table and talk about the farm, the way 2 people talk about a place they have both been watching, from different sides of the fence line, for a long time. She is teaching me what she knows about the timber on the ridge, and the way the drainage runs in a wet year and the particular behavior of the pond in early thaw. She watched this land for 31 years from the east side. There's a great deal she knows that I am still learning. I keep the deed in the roll-top desk, in the same drawer where the letter was. It is a copy, the certified one from the county courthouse, the one the clerk slid through the window on a Tuesday morning without blinking. The original recorded version lives with June's office, but I like having the copy in the desk. I like knowing it is there when I open the drawer to get a pen. My grandfather filed a deed with my name on it. He filed it 4 years before he died. He told no one. He just did the thing that needed doing and trusted the paperwork to hold, and trusted the land to stay land, and trusted that the person he had spent 25 summers teaching would come back and ask the right question. He was right about all of it. He had always been right about the things that mattered and quiet about being right, which I understand now was the whole lesson. I think about that every time I go to the county road and unlock the gate. The cedar post gate that he set himself that I helped him reset after the flood year. The chain, the lock I have the key for. Every morning I unlock it I am doing the same thing he did for 50 years, which is show up for what needs showing up for. No announcement. No audience. Just the gate and the key and the land behind it that has a deed with the right name on it, in a drawer in a desk, waiting quietly the way recorded things wait. He handed me the tools. He filed the deed. He left the letter in the drawer and trusted the right person would open it. He never once said, I'm doing this for you. He just did it, the way he did everything that mattered. That's what choosing looks like when it is so deep in a person it doesn't even feel like a choice anymore. It just feels like tending. Like repainting the shutters every spring without being asked. Like fixing the fence from opposite ends until you meet in the middle. Family is not the name on the estate paperwork. It is not the one who acts as executor when you are overseas. It is not the one who plants a lockbox on a cedar post gate and calls it administration. It is the woman with the notebook and the soup and 31 years of watching from the east side. It is the lawyer above the farm supply store who picks up the phone before you leave the parking lot. It is the man who filed a deed 4 years before his death and trusted that the right person would come to the courthouse and ask the right question. It is everyone who held what needed holding while you were gone. That is who gets to sit at the table. That is who is always going to sit at the table. My grandfather made sure of it. In the quiet, careful way he made sure of everything. That's my story. 2 paragraphs in a drawer I almost didn't open. One Tuesday morning at a records window with a clerk who didn't blink. And one neighbor who kept a notebook for 14 months on the chance that someone would come home and need it. If someone has been holding something for you while you were somewhere hard, tell them this week, before you learn the cost of not saying it. If this story found you at the right time, share it with someone who has ever been told their absence was permission. Comment below with one word for what it felt like to come home. I read every one. Subscribe because the next story is just as quiet and just as specific, and it ends the same way all the true ones do. In the hands it was always meant to be in. I'll see you in the next one.